Greetings to the family, Dr. David Roots. You have no unalienable human rights. Never forget this. This is David Roots TV. This is our topic for today. You have no unalienable human rights. Why am I saying this? Why is someone who, is possibly known, if you watch my other videos, you can see that I'm into things like sovereignty, I'm into freedom, why would I be saying to the world that you have no unalienable human rights? And down the bottom on my title screen, I have a chain linked, hands and chain versus a fist. A fist is always a raised fist. It's a symbol of what? Freedom, self-determination, power. I'm juxtaposing the two, and I'm saying that you have no unalienable human rights. And I'm also saying never forget this. Why would I be saying this? Well, let's stay tuned. David Roots TV. Make sure you like and subscribe and share this video if you enjoy the content. So let's first get into the context of unalienable human rights. I'll see if I can keep saying that. That's a tongue twister. Unalienable human rights. And where does that come from? Well, many people that immediately will ring a bell and know that particular phrase, that particular text, comes from the Declaration of Independence, the United States Declaration of Independence. And I have a bit of a history timeline on the side, which dates back to 1776. It's different than the U.S. Constitution, okay? So it must be, people tend to confuse the two. The U.S. Constitution and the Declaration of Independence are very different. But in the Declaration of Independence, which was written before the United States Constitution, there is this passage that's often quoted, and it says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." So let's unpick that a minute and put it into context, because as it says here, the Declaration justified the independence of the United States by listing the 27 colonial grievances against King George of Britain at that time. And that's who the American colonies were saying, sticking their finger up and saying, we have a right to be free. We have a right to be independent from the tyranny of Britain, and all of their produce and the different things that they were making. They were being taxed by the king, and they said, no, enough of this. We want to be free. And they came up with this reason why, because we have to understand that feudal systems during that time and earlier were very powerful, including the one of Britain. Okay. And so it took a lot for these so-called founding fathers of the United States to think about why they had the right, as Englishmen before that, because that's what they would have been. They would have been colonizers, given the right to colonize that whole area, the so-called right to colonize, the authority to colonize that area by the crown. What made them now think that they had the right for their own, as they said, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness? And so they write in the text that why? Well, they hold the truth to be self-evident. In other words, they're saying, it's obvious. All men are created equal, whether you're a sovereign or whether you're a commoner. That why? Because that they are endowed by their Creator. Okay, so they're saying that this endowment by the one that created all things endowed everyone equally with these unalienable rights, and that chief among these rights, and they list these three, are the right to life, the right to liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Okay, so those are the rights that they list for themselves. And these themes of life and liberty and pursuit of happiness will continue to come up. Okay, so this is the unalienable rights. Now, this discussion, and I have it down here on the side, it says alienable, that can be surrendered or given up. And they're saying that these are unalienable. They cannot be surrendered, no matter even if you want to, and they cannot be given up. All right? They cannot be taken away, they're saying, basically by anyone. Now, this discussion came up for me, and the time of recording this video is February 2022. And for those people that are watching the video in the future, they should know, I'm sure, that this is about this is during the time period of COVID-19, and there are many people discussing, even though we are at the sort of the ending period of this, 2 years on from this so-called pandemic. There are many people discussing their rights, okay, the right to freedom, the right to freedom of choice, things along those lines. And I was having a discussion with someone, a group of people, in fact, about sovereignty and about, so someone brought up this idea that there are unalienable rights that every individual has, okay, unalienable rights, and they brought up the Declaration of Human Rights, which we're going to talk about in a minute as well. And I said, from my perspective, that there's no such thing as unalienable human rights. And so this presentation is going to go over the reasons why I say that. And so this is the first part of the piece of the puzzle, that in the 1700s, the Declaration of Independence says to the American people that we have unalienable rights in their life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So where did this come from? Well, let's jump forward now. I mentioned the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. 200 years later, drafted by a UN committee chaired by Eleanor Roosevelt, was adopted by the General Assembly on the 10th of December 1948. We have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is a slew of different statements with some context in the original document, the rights that people have internationally, and these rights were put towards the members of the United Nations, and most of them ratified it, but it must be said that it says down the bottom, 8 abstained and 2 did not vote. And the ones that abstained were at that time, the Soviet Union and the former Soviet Union bloc, okay, as well as South Africa also abstained. And of course they would, because they had the system of apartheid in their country during that particular time. So the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a list of them, some of the key ones: we are all born free with equal rights. We have a right to be free from discrimination. We have a right to live in freedom and safety. We have a right to be free from slavery. Very similar, of course, to what occurred 200 years before with the Declaration of Independence. Okay, and obviously the writers of this would have taken the Declaration of Independence into thought when they were constructing this idea of human rights. But if you really look, this idea of having unalienable rights and the idea of human rights in general has come over time in human society. It's only humans, really, man and mankind, that come up with these grandiose ideas and want to not only verbalize them but put them on paper as well. Other members of the living races of the world, the animal kingdom, the plant kingdom, they don't necessarily state it in these ways, this idea of the right to life, liberty, and freedom. So where does this concept come from? This is not going to be a comprehensive history lesson. You can go and do your more research on it if you want. But one key period that gave rise to this idea of unalienable rights and human rights was the Age of Enlightenment. Now, the Age of Enlightenment is this time period that generally is considered to have occurred around the 1700s, okay, the early 1700s. And it was during the time basically towards when there was a lot of colonialism and imperialism going on around the world. And that colonialism and imperialism was creating wealth for many of the nations around the world, in particular the European nations. And from that wealth, there was a lot more time for people to educate themselves and to explore knowledge. And with this exploration of knowledge came a better understanding of science and technology, and the knowledge base of people just grew. Okay, lots of discoveries were made during this time, And so people started to move away from the pre-existing structures of church and of the feudal system as well, in particular in Europe. And one of the key places was in France. And so you had chief writers like on the concept like Voltaire. He was an advocate of freedom of speech, freedom of religion, separation of church and state. So you can encapsulate his ideas in this quote that I wrote, where he says, "So long as the people do not care to exercise their freedom, those who wish to tyrannize will do so, for tyrants are active and ardent, and will devote themselves in the name of any number of gods, religious and otherwise, to put shackles upon sleeping men." So that was Voltaire, just one of his many, many writings. And here you can talk, here he's giving this idea of freedom, okay? That people, if you don't exercise your freedom, someone will come and take it away, okay? And particularly he talks about tyrants, and of course he's talking about the church, and he's also talking about feudal systems, as well as probably, you know, the wealthy as well. And he wasn't alone. He got a lot of his ideas from, you know, in particular this gentleman, John Locke, who was an Englishman, and he's known as the father of liberalism. And he says that one of the quotes by John Locke, "All men by nature are equal, in that equal right that every man have to his natural freedom." Okay, again, this idea of freedom is coming to bore, without being subject to the will or authority of any other man. Being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. So what he's saying there is that as long as you don't harm anyone else, in terms of their life, their health, their possessions, then you should have the right to do whatever you want. So these were the types of ideas that were coming about during this Age of Enlightenment. Of course, on the Declaration of Independence came shortly after this, or during this time period as well. Okay, and so obviously they would have been looking towards their counterparts in Europe and saying, you know, we have these rights as well as people of this new nation that was forming in America. But the idea of rights came long before that. I mean, if we look at the whole of human history, it's obvious that, you know, the idea of human rights and the right to freedom didn't originate in Europe. And I just put two examples here. So, for example, in Islam, with the development of Islam and the spreading of Islam, in particular, in North Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, it really changed society. And one of the ways to change society is that there was a lot more equality, I would say, and not just equality, but what's the word? People's lives were changed for the better, especially for people who would have been marginalized in non-Islamic societies before that. And so I just took this from Wikipedia. You can see that you know, one of the writers on this says that historians generally agree that Muhammad preached against what he saw as the social evils of the day, and that Islamic social reforms in areas such as social security, family structure, slavery, and the rights of women and ethnic minorities were intended to improve on. Okay, and so, you know, women were given the rights to do certain things and certain protections as well that they might not have had previous to that. Slavery was modified in a way that even that slaves or people that were considered slaves had certain rights, and if they became Muslims, I'm pretty sure that the idea of slavery was basically moot. Okay, so Islam and other religions as well, but in particular we can look at Islam, enshrine certain rights within people, showing that the development of people's societies, thinking that there's a right to freedom and a right to, you know, certain other human rights, occurred before the Age of Enlightenment. We can even go back as far as ancient Egypt and look at something like, for example, the laws of Ma'at, which are otherwise called the 42 negative confessions, and they just, you know, they are a list of different rules that and sort of they're called laws, but certain ideals that an individual would have tried to live by, and within those ideals that would have also guaranteed the rights of others, because you weren't supposed to do certain things that would hurt other people. So this idea of rights, and in the text I write here that the ancient Egyptians saw men and women as well as people from all social classes but slaves as basically equal under the law, and even the poorest peasants were allowed to request a vizier you know, person that was representing a king. So even as far back as what's this 29, 25, when the laws of Ma'at, you know, there's evidence that they were being used from way back then, kind of enshrine rights of people, obviously in different ways than we might look at it today. But the point is that this idea of human rights has been around in human society for a very, very long time. And still, yet still, I would say that you have no unalienable human rights, and that you should never forget this. Now, why do I say this? Why do I, David Root, say this? Well, we only need to look at history. We see over history, over time, we have all of these societies we just mentioned. We mentioned that, you know, in the Americas, the founding fathers, so-called founding fathers of America, talked about the Declaration of Independence. You have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was done by the United Nations and all of the member states, except for a few of them. You have, you know, Islam, you have, you know, the laws of Ma'at, this long time span of when humans have been considered, you know, wise enough to think about the rights of others. Even in the Bible, you have, you know, love thy neighbor as thyself, and the Ten Commandments, which should, you know, enshrine certain rights towards others. But yet still, during those times and over that time period, even by the same people that are trying to say that they enshrine these unalienable human rights, that they and people within society, their human rights have been taken away. The human rights that they say that they should have, namely life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, and freedom. We only need to look, and I listed on the side, things like colonialism. I mean, America, which had the Declaration of Independence, which has the U.S. Constitution, which guarantees rights for its citizens, has said that, you know, through their actions, that yes, we have the right for our citizens to all these things, but others won't, because America, you can go and watch my video on America, the biggest colonizer. They are one of the worst chief offenders around the world in terms of colonialism and imperialism. Okay? But that also can include Great Britain, that also can include France, these places that are seen as bastions of human rights and the guarantee of human rights and freedom and choice. Okay? We can look at things like war, for example. Right now in February 22, there's a significant issue between Russia and the Ukraine, where Russia is said to be, you know, potentially encroaching on the sovereign lands of the Ukraine, and there may be a possible war. Okay, we have things like slavery, which is still going on to this day. Things like human trafficking, which is still going on to this day. But we also have the biological aspects to look at as well. Okay, yes, you say that, you know, you have these unalienable, meaning, remember, alienable means that cannot be taken. Sorry, alienable means can be withdrawn or taken away. So if you have unalienable, okay, that means they cannot be withdrawn, cannot be taken away. So, but biology shows us, for example, that your right to life, liberty, happiness, and freedom can be taken away, whether it's through disease, whether it's through predation, whether it's through competition, whether it's through parasitism. There's always, that's the laws of the universe. That's the way the laws of the universe work. As above, so below. The laws of polarity. You have the negative, you have the positive. Okay, the laws of vibration, the oscillation of life. Okay, yes, you may think you have the right to something, but somebody else might think they have the right to something as well. Okay, and it might just be the same thing. Okay, and I put some imageries there, you know, rest in peace to George Floyd, who's now amongst the ancestors as a soul. His right to life was taken away. His right to freedom was taken away. We have Nelson Mandela, who's now passed as well, but he was put into jail for decades for what? Fighting for the rights of himself and his society against the apartheid regime. Okay, the brutal apartheid regime. And people will say, well, those things were in the past. Right now we have, in China, there's a huge controversy where people are saying that the Uyghurs of China, that's the UIGHAR, which is a ethnic group in the sort of western, sort of northwestern China, okay, that are Muslims, that they are undergoing genocide, okay, and that many of them are going missing, that they're being put into internment camps, for example, as well as just disappearing as well, okay. We have the Native American people who, you know, what happened to their rights? The Declaration of Independence said people have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but that obviously didn't take place for the Native American people in that country. If you look at that imagery I took off the internet, you can look at where their lands were when the colonizers arrived and where they are now, you know, and it's probably even worse now, of course, okay. And of course we have the most recent worldwide situation with COVID-19, and how many of the rights that are supposed to be enshrined by developed nations of the world, such as the right to freedom of choice, has been taken away. People have been told that if they don't get vaccinated, for example, they won't have a job, that if you send your child to certain schools that they must wear a mask, that people you know, are being told where and when they can leave their houses, what they're calling lockdown. A lot of this is kind of thankfully, you know, moving on from that. But having lived through it for the past 2 years, I can tell you that this idea of having unalienable human rights doesn't exist, okay. And we must never forget this, okay. Now, I'm not saying this to say that you should lie down and you should just let people walk over you, and that, you know, there's a reason I'm saying this, okay. And the reason I'm saying this and saying that we should never forget is that if you want any of these things, whether it's life, whether it's your own liberty, which is aka freedom, okay, right to choice, you want to make your own happiness, you need to work for that. You need to fight for that, okay. And if you're able to establish relationships with people, individuals, societies, communities that want to guarantee that, then great, okay. And but as a community, then you're going to have to fight for it, because there will always be an individual, another community, another country, or whatever, that may want those things from you. And history says that. If you look at Genghis Khan, if you look at, you know, the Romans, if you look at the, you know, Islam versus Christianity, so on and so on. If you want your rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in the way that you see fit, then you have to fight for that. And that's something we must teach our children, to not put blinkers over their eyes and think that this society that they live in, for the vast majority of people, is there to guarantee their rights. Because when you look deeper, in most societies which are governed by two things, money and political control, which is synonymous with a spiritual aspect, your rights are not guaranteed. And if you don't want to take my word for it, you can look at history and look at all those places where that have said, oh, you have unalienable human rights, and look at their record. There's only, though, 3 places where your rights are guaranteed, that you actually do have unalienable rights as a human, okay. So please go watch my video on divine sovereignty, where I talk about this a bit more. But those 3 places are in your heart, okay, aka your core beliefs. You have a right to have a core belief, and no one can take that away from you, okay. Within your consciousness, your conscience, okay, your mind, you have a right to think the way that you want, to hold a certain level of consciousness, okay. And within your soul, because your soul, the way I see it, the way you see it is up to you, but your soul, you know, is of a divine living nature, which animates your physical body, which when that soul leaves, your physical body becomes inanimate, isn't it? Okay. But that soul is a divine contract between you and the Most High, you and the Creator, whichever way you want to unpick that. So you have an unalienable right to that connection. So those are the 3 places: your beliefs, your core beliefs, meaning the way you think about, not think, but the beliefs that you hold on life, okay, which may change, but that's your right to change those core beliefs. your thoughts and your right ability to think and make choices, okay, and your connection with the Creator. No one can take those things away from you unless you give them up. And this is where this argument comes in on the bottom of the screen, talking about sovereignty versus divine sovereignty. The reason that they cannot be taken away, unlike those other rights which are just established between, the just ideals and a utopic vision established between communities of people. These rights are not established between communities of people. Okay, they're within you. Okay, and when you look at sovereignty, I put some of the ways of you can, Wikipedia has a nice article on sovereignty, and it lists some of the ways that sovereignty can be obtained, and it talks about secession, which is the transfer of territory from one state to another, usually by means of treaty. Okay, in other words, you might have some rights with other people, but they might change the treaty or not agree to the treaty. Occupation, acquisition of territory that belongs to no state. So you might think you have rights to something, whether it's land or, particular to education, whatever. And someone who with more power comes in and says, no, well, you can't do that. What taking over this? Okay. Prescription, effective control of territory of another acquiescent state. So for example, you may have certain rights, but you get too weak due to illness or due to some other factor, and so your rights can be taken away because you've acquiesced, or someone else around you has acquiesced. You may be living with someone and that person can't defend their rights, so by default they have acquiesced. Operations of nature. Okay, so in other words, you may have a certain right to something. You may think you have a right to life, liberty, all those things. But for example, you're swimming in the sea, and it's you and it's the animals in the sea, like a shark. Who has the right to life? You or the shark? Well, both of you do, hey? Yeah, so if that shark decides to come along and make a meal of you, have they transgressed your unalienable human rights? And can you do anything about it? No, you can't. You have to fight for your rights. Okay? Adjudication and conquest. So you get the idea that in terms of sovereignty, all these things can be taken away from you by someone else, whether it's a person, a collective of person, a state, and so on and so on, with the power that's greater than yours. So if you make the mistake of thinking that you have an unalienable human rights, and if you teach your children that, you make yourself vulnerable, and you make them vulnerable in the future to enshrine those rights. Okay, and in fact, the Declaration of Independence is a good example, because they declared that, but they still had to fight for them. They had to fight for those rights, and that's something that we need to teach our children. Rest in peace, George Floyd and Nelson Mandela. You have to fight for your rights. There's no such thing as an unalienable human rights. And yes, while the Universal Declaration of Human Rights signed by all of these countries, all of these member states, may be something that's very notable and something that's very lofty, and we need to try to live up and rise to that ideal. The reality is that life doesn't work like that. Why? Because there's a universal laws that govern life, and I mentioned some of them early on. So to close this video is meant to be a positive video and an empowering video. Okay, on one side you have the chain, and that chain is the greatest chains are the chain within, isn't it? Within the mind. And one of those chains would be you having this idea that you have unalienable human rights and that things should be guaranteed towards you. Because when things are guaranteed towards you, when you think like that, it's like being in a welfare state. Okay, it makes you passive. Versus, the raised hand or raised fist, which suggests power, which suggests ability, which suggests the desire to do something. The hand and the fist, clenched fist, and the raised arm. All of those things suggest action. Okay, we need to never forget that if you want rights, we need to be on the right hand side, which is the action side, to guarantee your rights. And the best way to get those rights, of course, is through effort, knowledge, okay, and as we said, relationships. Those are the ways that you can best try to achieve those lofty ideals. But outside of that, the only unalienable human rights are within here. Your core beliefs, your consciousness, and your divine connection with the Most High. No one can take that away, and that's what we must teach our children so that it goes through the generation. That's the unalienable human rights that we need to continue to cultivate and to thrive. This is Dr. David Roots, David Roots TV. I hope you found this educational. If you did, please share, please like and comment below. Thank you for listening.